This is senior correspondent LaChocolateBox here with DPTV Networks. We're at the Eminent Studio in Harlem, and I have the honor of interviewing one of the coveted Tuskegee Airmen, Mr. Julius T. Freeman. Mr. Freeman has been an advocate in, I guess, teaching young kids about your Tuskegee history as a serviceman, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And we're just going to ask some questions about your life. I spoke with you earlier.
Yes.
And I told you that I did some research and, you know, I wrote questions, but I am so well known for just going off the mark. So we're just going to get started. So how are you?
Fine and dandy, just like candy.
Okay, so right now you're located in
Springfield Gardens, New York.
Gardens.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
And you're originally from
Columbus, Ohio.
Ohio.
Right.
So I have to know, when you were a young man, what was your mindset? You know, were you one of those kids who said, look, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a veterinarian, or I want to be a serviceman?
Well, no, back in those days, I was impressed with automobiles.
Okay.
And I was very concerned about cars. And I can remember back in a town called Lancaster, Kentucky, a small town, 1,400 people. I'd sit on the corner and close my eyes, and as the cars would go by, I could tell the make of car by the sounding of the engine.
Right.
And I told my peers, you know, one day I'm going to have cars like no one else had.
And this is like an idea that led you into the service?
Well, no. Segregation and prejudice left me in service. That's why I entered the service.
Yeah, we definitely are going to touch on that. So, but since you brought it up, you're saying that segregation led you into the service,
that is
but
correct.
The disparity of segregation at that time in the service.
That's correct.
You know, in doing some research, there was a gentleman who was also an airman who noted that the POWs, the German POWs, were actually treated better than the black servicemen.
Definitely.
Tell us about that.
Because when the Tuskegee Airmen were on the train, they would take the fellows from the North and the Midwest and send them south for training.
Okay.
And once you crossed the Mason-Dixie line, you had to go behind the smoke car, which is the car behind this car that has these coal in it, and smoke and soot gets in your face and eyes and what have you. And at one time, they had prisoners of war, that was Germans, and they took the Tuskegee Airmen out of their train seats and brought them over behind the smoke cars.
Behind the cars.
Yeah. They were treated better than American soldiers were back in those days.
Yet the pride.
You know, the prejudice back in the days is why I decided to go in service.
Okay.
Because I was working on the farm and working for 50 cents a day.
Y'all hear that? 50 cents a day.
Yeah.
And we complain about minimum wage, but people made it on 50 cents a day.
Oh, yes. Well,
You know?
actually, everything was very reasonable back in those days. In fact, I had to leave school with a 9th grade education to take care of my mother.
Wow.
And I rented a house at $7 a month. It was a railroad type house. In other words, you walk into a living room, bedroom, and kitchen.
Okay.
And $7 a month.
Wow. Unbelievable. I just know that there's so much story there. Let's go back a little bit. So you love cars. And then this whole idea of prejudice is what actually brought you towards the military. Instead of repelling you from being a serviceman, even knowing what you were going to deal with, you still went towards. Is it that you wanted to make a difference?
Yes, I definitely wanted to make a difference and improve my situation, because I've always been the type of person that liked to lift myself up.
Okay.
You know, we have the old saying that you should lift yourself up by your bootstraps. But when I speak to children today, I tell them not to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, but lift themselves up with their mind.
With their mind,
That's
definitely.
Everything is in the mind.
Okay, so what age did you enlist?
17.
17,
Yes.
and where was that at? Where did you enlist? Where did you train?
I was from Lexington, Kentucky, and I was introduction into service in Camp Atterbury, Indiana.
Okay.
I served 2 days in the Army, then I volunteered for the Air Force. And they sent me to Wichita Falls, Texas. I took my basic training in Wichita Falls. In Shepherdfield, Texas it was called.
And that's where you linked up with the Tuskegee?
No,
Okay.
there we had a lot of race riots back in those days because they had the Westfield and Eastfield.
Okay.
The blacks was on the west side, the whites was on the east side.
Okay.
And what started the race riot, there was no women of color in this town of Wichita Falls.
Did you say women of color?
No, none whatsoever.
None?
No,
In a whole entire town?
no. Little hick town.
Okay.
None was there.
Okay.
And they decided to have a dance. And they went to a town called Lawton, Oklahoma, and bring women in for the soldiers to dance with. But they brought only white women in. And back in those days, no person of color would be able to dance with a white woman.
Okay.
So we had fellows that started dancing, tuxedo junks and take D.A.T.A training and things of that nature. And the MPs wanted us to get off the floor. So they got a rope and was pushing us off on the floor. And there was guys there from Gary, Indiana. And Gary, Indiana is noted for prize fighters.
That's true. There's a lot going on there.
MPs pushed the fellow back. The fellow hit him and knocked him out, and that started the race riot.
Okay.
And by the end of it, there was about 15 soldiers was killed, about 6 was hurt.
15 soldiers of color? Or just
No,
in general?
non-color.
Non-color? Oh, wow.
And they put an F on our folders and sent us to Seymour Johnson's Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And we stayed there a couple of days. We could not go into the PX and buy cigarettes or anything because it was very segregated. And from there, they shipped us to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. We stayed there for 3 days.
Okay.
Then they shipped us to Staten Island, New York. And the next thing I knew, I was on a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. 10 days later, I landed in Le Havre, France, at Camp Atterbury, France.
Okay.
And even there was still prejudice there because they had Jeeps.
That's true.
And they had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the Jeeps. And we'd spent so much time on the ocean, and being young, 17, 18 years of age, we decided to...
Well, you were still considered a man, though.
Oh yeah.
So
much so.
It don't matter. You were still considered a man. What was your position at that time or your title?
I was a medical technician.
Medical technician?
My MOS was 409, which is a medical technician. And we went AWOL and went into Paris because we had to go see the women, you know, how it is back in the days,
wow.
okay?
See, my ears, my young ears shouldn't be hearing stuff like that. At what point did you actually, I guess, were you assigned as a Tuskegee Airman?
That would happen in 1946 after I served in Europe, Germany and France, Belgium and Italy. And when I returned back to the States, I was stationed at Lockburn Air Force Base under Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, a man that I admire very much so because this man spent 4 years in West Point and no one spoke to him. He had to eat by himself, sleep by himself, and they would not have any conversation with him. And he ended up being our commanding officer.
Now, let me stop you there. When we spoke earlier, you said that when you actually were assigned with Tuskegee, you were 19 years old. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure.
So you traveled all of Europe in 2 years and then came back only at the age of 19. Right. So to the studio audience out there, Mr. Freeman wasn't even what's considered in today's society a grown man. You know, no. you weren't even the age of 21. You were 19 years old.
That is correct.
19 years old, and you'd already traveled so many countries. That is amazing. See, you know, when doing research on anyone, such as yourself, and I did say that I did, but I would never have known that. That's the sort of thing that they would never teach us. No one would ever teach us. You would actually have to sit down and speak to someone to know these things.
Well, that's true. Well, even so, that most people do not realize that every Tuskegee Airman was not a pilot. You
That's
know,
true.
everyone thinks I have 3 automobiles that I travel around with, and I have the sign on the car
Right.
stating Tuskegee Airman. And I've been the Grand Marshal when they named Oak Street Tuskegee Airman Way in Long Island.
Okay.
And everyone thinks that every Tuskegee Airman was a pilot, but that's not true. There was 996 pilots, but there was 13,000 support groups.
Okay.
Each pilot needed 10 men to support his plane and load the ammunition and bombs and things of that nature. So there were also women.
Right. That's something that you were saying, that there were
At Columbus,
women.
Ohio, at
Okay.
Lockburn Air Force Base, we had 300 WACs. They were called WACs. They were nurses, they were secretaries, they worked as medical technicians as well.
Now, what was the acronym again? WACs?
Lockburn Air Force Base.
What were the female service people called?
They were called WACs.
WACs?
W-A-X, yes.
What does that stand for?
Women's Air Course of that nature.
Okay,
I'm not sure.
okay.
But WACs they were called.
Okay. Wow.
And they did beautiful work.
Okay.
Some of them worked on airplanes. They were mechanics.
Okay. Now, let me ask you something. Did you have to go through any special training at that time just to be considered for that assignment
you had
at Tuskegee?
learn about giving
Okay.
shots and
Okay.
dressing wounds and things of that nature.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I came across at that time, in case, again, the audience didn't know, is that black men were told at that time they couldn't fly. They couldn't be mechanics. They couldn't be medics. But you would agree that when we do it as a people, we do it well.
Well,
we do
to
it
be
well.
honest with you, the government, the United States government, back in 1925,
Yes.
they
The Army War
stated-
College?
They
Yes.
stated that Negroes were inadequate.
Yes.
They were not capable of
That's
doing
true.
anything
If
technical.
can I quote?
Yes.
It was in November of 1925, the Army War College presented a study, correct, which assessed in their eyes that African Americans lacked the intelligence to serve in higher ranking military roles or in those roles which required intellect. They said that the pure blood American Negro was inferior to the white population in mental capacity. They said that Negroes lacked initiative, okay? They displayed little or no leadership and couldn't accept responsibility. And at some point, they stated that the defects were greater in the Southern Negro. So I find that profound because from what I understand, when testing and training, you actually had to do 3 or 4 times better because in some cases, it was stated that those tests were meant for you to fail.
Yes, well, actually, the beginning of the Tuskegee Airmen was not supposed to be a successful situation.
No,
It's called
they
an
weren't.
experiment.
Yes,
Okay.
it was.
And only when Eleanor Roosevelt came to Tuskegee and when Chief Anderson took her up in a plane. But in those days, your officers that was training were all white.
Right.
And the pilots had to take abuse that was unreal. It was called boy and things of that nature, although they were lieutenants. And only after she went up in the plane that things changed for the Tuskegee Airmen. And they gave airplanes that took 3 planes to make 1 plane was operative. In other words, they took 3 junk planes and they take parts. The mechanics had to take parts off this plane, put on there, and took 3 planes to make 1 plane that would fly.
Well, you actually answered part of a question. You know, as part of this interview, we had a social media Q&A. And we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to give you some of those questions. We have a mayor from Asbury Park, New Jersey. we have a retired professor, we have a businessman, and they all wanted to know about you. So, but we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Once again, this is your correspondent, LaChocolateBox, and I'm here with Julius T. Freeman, and we'll be back. Give us a few moments. Once again, this is senior host and correspondent LaChocolateBox for DPTV Networks, and we're here at the M&N El Barrio Firehouse Community Media Center. So at the break, we were just going through, I guess, the incident with Eleanor Roosevelt. And we do have a social media question, a Q&A that we put out, and we kind of selected some of those questions. So this one is from actually a retired theater and speech professor, Darrell Willis Sr. From Monmouth County, New Jersey, and he was asking what the true story of Eleanor Roosevelt's visit to Tuskegee, Alabama. Was it really to check out the progress of the airmen?
Yes, she came there.
Okay.
And they had all white officers there. And she said that she would like to take a flight. And right away, the officer wanted to point her out and have a white officer to take her up. She says, no, I want to fly with him, who happened to be Chief Anderson.
Wow.
And she got in his plane, and the photographer was there, and the press was there, of course. And they took pictures of her getting in the plane and taking off and flying around. And when they landed, she left and went back to Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband was Franklin Roosevelt.
Right, right.
She said, those boys can fly. They are ready. And that started the Tuskegee Airmen to be able to do more flights.
Okay.
And they were first assigned to fly along the border and shoot up trucks and planes and things of that nature. In fact, one of the boys, they laughed because he said, oh, I killed my first chain.
You know, and, so to me, it sounded like she was actually a supporter of
She was
guys.
very
Okay.
much so.
Okay.
Had it not been for her, probably would not have been successful.
Okay.
But she was very instrumental in the success.
So it was
of
her
the
and not her
Tuskegee,
husband.
Right, because it was an experiment that was not supposed to be successful.
Right.
And of course, we weren't supposed not to be able to do anything technical.
Right.
But
some researchers thought that it was Franklin D. Roosevelt that actually signed off on the creation of the Tuskegee experiment.
That is true, but
okay. For his black supporters, and now is that the case as well?
NAACP and
Right.
Urban League and different companies wanted them to have a training for blacks to be able to fly.
And what year was that when she visited?
1941.
1941. Okay. 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 Great.
Because we had pilots previously, prior to the Tuskegee Airmen, but not in this country. They flew in France and other countries, but not here, because in those days we were not supposed to be able to handle anything technical.
No.
Right.
No, you definitely weren't. As a matter of fact, okay, CEO and founder of the Black Poetry Cafe, Mr. Mark Goggins asked, what are your personal feelings about America and the state of race relations prior to joining the military and while you were there? And did your feelings ultimately change once you got out and came back to, I guess, America once you've traveled overseas?
Well, to be honest with you, when I returned November the 8th, 1948, I threw away all of my uniforms.
Wow, okay.
Because after all the success and the things that the Tuskegee Airmen had achieved in Europe, because the bombing of Berlin, the Tuskegee Airmen was only supposed to fly halfway. They didn't want the people of color to be able to have the honor of dropping bombs, causing bombs to be dropped in Berlin.
Okay.
They were supposed to fly halfway, and then a white organization was supposed to take over and fly the final.
So let me interrupt you. You guys at some point were considered, or the group, the infantry, was considered to be the protectors. Is that one of the reasons why they would paint the tail of the plane red. They were also termed the red tails. Is that correct?
Actually, that was after the
That was
point,
after?
they got the P-51 planes. They decided they wanted to be recognized because they were the first new planes that the Tuskegee Airmen had received. And they wanted to be recognized because at that time, all the bomber pilots, they knew that we could not fly it. They thought we couldn't.
Okay.
And on a number of occasions, the Tuskegee Airmen protected them and prevented them from being shot down. And after that, they were requested to escort the bombers.
Okay.
And actually, when the white pilots did not show up, the Tuskegee Airmen had to fly the full flight from into Germany. And they escorted the bombers to Berlin. They dropped the bombs, and it is stated that they never lost a bomber to enemy fire.
Now, give us a perspective on what the distance was for that. How long would that, how many miles?
Roughly, I would say it was about 800 miles or so.
800 miles.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They would have to fly.
Right.
Solo.
Yes.
Wow. That is amazing.
Yeah.
That is amazing. You know, I'm thinking about the time period where nowadays, you know, planes have the, you know, option of speaking to an air traffic controller, and they have these 3 two-way radios, that sort of thing. What did you have? What type of equipment, you know, was in those planes?
They had regular mics in the plane. They could talk to each other.
They could talk,
right.
Okay.
But speaking of the Army, the Air Force rather, I was discharged November 8, 1948. At that time, when I came down the gangplank, there was the old familiar sign, colored and white.
Right.
I was so disturbed, I threw away all of my uniforms. I had nothing to do with military from 1948 to 2007, when a very dear friend of mine who passed away was a pilot. His name was Bill Wheeler, lived in Hempstead.
Okay.
He came to me and he says, JT, they call me JT for short. He says, you've been very active in the automobile business. You designed cars for Sammy Davis and James Brown, Wilson Pickett, Rose Morgan, and all the entertainers, including selling Joe Louis a Rolls Royce. I would like for you to come back and help keep the legacy of the Tuskegee alive.
Is that when you decided to come out and, I guess, you know, to teach?
In 2007, I had nothing to do with the military from 1948 to 2007. And I joined the local Tuskegee Airmen we meet at Kennedy Airport. And ever since then, I go to schools and colleges. I just taught at Cooper University here in New York last week. And I was very pleased to find out that Abe Lincoln spoke there.
Wow.
And Frederick Douglass spoke there. And I found out that 5 presidents spoke there. And last week,
you know,
J.T. Freeman spoke there. And
beautiful.
I was very pleased.
Now, I have to ask you a question. What was it like receiving the Congressional Gold Medal? And what year was that?
That was March 31st, 2007.
Well, you know that day.
Oh,
I know.
Yeah, it was a great thing. Well,
exactly.
I'll tell you, it was a beautiful situation because we had a gentleman, President of the United States at the time. He had 300 of us to come to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. That's the Congressional Gold Medal there.
Okay.
And
which president? That was Bush, right? Was
Yeah.
it? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
President Bush. It was a great day.
Right.
But it was not the highlight of my life.
Right.
The highlight of my life came January the 20th, 2009, when President Obama stated that he stood on our shoulders and had 300 of us to come to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. That was fabulous.
That was beautiful.
That was the highlight of my life.
That was beautiful. If I'm not mistaken, I think I saw the camera pan the group of gentlemen standing there. There was one of the news facilities that actually panned a group of Tuskegee Airmen as you were standing. Okay,
It was cold, but Our
you
hearts was
know,
warm.
hey, president, it doesn't matter what president it is, you know.
It was
Doesn't you come
fantastic.
out, and that's what you do.
Yeah.
It's such an honor sitting here with you. I'm just an emotional wreck sitting here trying to keep it together. In 2013, you quoted that as long as there is air in your body, that you will always tell the Tuskegee story. What made you get to that point after not being involved with military or talking about it for so long?
Well, the reason why I'm the youngest Tuskegee Airman, in April I'll be 88 years of age.
Okay.
And I've been blessed.
Bravo. Bravo for making it to that point. Bravo.
God has been very good to me, and I've been
Yes.
very blessed. And I'm the only Tuskegee Airman at this point that can get around. I have, in Queens, there's 3 of us left.
Okay.
The fellow next to me is 90 years of age. There's another one that's 92. Here in Manhattan, there's 5 here in Manhattan, but our treasurer is 95. His name is D.O.T.A. He lives here in Manhattan.
So
He's 95.
you mentioned in total, how many were there, not to interrupt you? How many in total?
Originally, there was 996 pilots and 13,000 support groups.
And how many are
Now
still
there's 120
surviving?
in the country. There's 3 in Queens, including myself. There's 5 in Manhattan, 2 in the Bronx, and 1 in Long Island.
Okay. What a beautiful story. What a beautiful story. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to have part of our studio audience. You know, there's some folks out there that want to ask you some questions. Are you ready for that?
Not a problem.
We've been just conversing it up about your life, your history, and some of the things you experienced while you were in the service. And we're now going to open up some of those questions to our studio audience. Who has a question for Mr. Freeman? Please tell us your name.
Scott Green is my name, and it's a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Freeman. I was wondering, how long were you in the military prior to 48 before you were?
I went in service in 1945, and I served to 1948.
Okay, so you were in the military for 3 years.
3.5 years to be exact,
Okay.
right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. You know what? I'm going to switch real quick while we're waiting for the audience, and I have a question for from Mayor Myra Campbell of Asbury Park, New Jersey, and she's actually a good friend of mine. So,
oh, beautiful.
Yeah, I know. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
I met Mayor Campbell at an event that I was hosting for women empowerment, and we just kind of became amigos. So I will be working with her on a panel for young women sometime in the near future. But Mayor Campbell says, how can we instill the pride and camaraderie in our youth that was held within the matrix of the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, to be honest with you, I travel throughout New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and I speak to the youth. Tell them to stay in school, get an education, which is very, very important. And I also advise them, when they're thinking of what they wish to do or be in life, study, make sure this is what they want to do. Don't play games with themselves. Once they've decided that what they want to do, let no one turn them around.
Wow.
And as I tell them, get on the good foot and get it together. And keep on keeping on. That's my advice.
Let me ask you a question. Where are some of the places that you've spoken? I know it's been all over New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, but...
Last week I was at Cooper University.
Okay.
And I was very pleased to be there because I found out that Abe Lincoln spoke there.
Beautiful.
As well as Frederick Douglass also spoke there. And 5 presidents of the United States spoke there. And to think that J.T. Freeman is there speaking, that was an honor.
Honestly, I'm honored to sit here with you right now. I feel that energy coming off of you, and it's so positive. And I can't imagine that any young person who is sitting back listening to you would not feel that, wouldn't feel that. Do we have any other questions from our studio audience? State your name.
How do you do? Nequan Murphy. And what I would like to know is, how come there aren't any kind of exhibits or museum exhibit permanently for the Tuskegee Airmen, because it's such an intricate part of this American history that the story should be, and the artifacts should be in these 5 boroughs. Since you have people within the 5 boroughs, you should have something here for you, so that we all can be educated and see what you've gone through. Any ideas on that, on how that can be accomplished? Or?
Yes. Well, actually, what I'm trying to do now, I've spoken to some politicians in reference to establishing a museum here in the 5 boroughs of New York. We have a museum out at 110 and Farmingdale. We have a P-51 suspended in the ceiling and a movie showing the Tuskegee Airmen achievements. But the kids that lives in Hempstead, Nassau County, Brooklyn, and Queens, they can't get out there because that's about a 65-mile trip and very difficult for them to get out there. So what I'm trying to do is get organizations together and establish a museum, Tuskegee Airmen Museum, someplace in the 5 boroughs of New York, because we have 8 million people here, and the youth, as I speak to them in schools and colleges and things of that nature, they are not aware of the achievement of the Tuskegee Airmen. So I want to bring that to front, and I have a lot of different items that was used in service. I've been a trap shooter. I have a lot of trophies. I have a TC Maserati I would like to show, and establish a museum so the youth of the 5 boroughs can be able to learn about the Tuskegee Airmen and their problems and prejudices and segregations that they had back in the 40s.
If I can just add, Mr. Freeman, there was another question that Darrell Willis, the retired professor, said. What did you think of the George Lucas movie Red Tails in terms of historical accuracy? Was it dead on, or was there some things missing?
Well, to be honest with you, I was with George Lucas 7 times at the premieres back in 2012.
Okay.
When we were in New York, I was on Broadway. I was at the Michael Jordan Theater in Harlem. The Red Tails was a good movie, but it was Hollywood.
Right.
And it did not show the segregation, the prejudice that the Tuskegee men had to endure back in the days.
Do you think that's because it was Hollywood? Because Hollywood sometimes overshadows that?
Everything there was basically done in Italy. It did not show anything with the segregation and the prejudice down south in Tuskegee and Alabama and other parts of the South. If you want to see a real good movie about the Tuskegee Airmen, it was filmed in 1995 with Lawrence Fishburne.
Right.
It's called Tuskegee.
Right.
That was the best movie. That showed the segregation, the prejudice, and things that we endured in those days.
In your mind, I guess in your opinion, what was the drive? Meaning, for those men who were there at that time, what made them keep going, knowing that they were dealing with this? Because they were dealing with a war, a segregation war at home, and they would come, they enlist in the military, and you're dealing with the same thing. To fight for a country that didn't necessarily respect you as a human being.
Well, they didn't respect us, and I never will forget when I was in Germany, I happened to be at a young lady's house, and she had a brother, and he was about 7 years old, and I was sitting there talking. All of a sudden, he gets in front of me, gets on his knees, and sat there and looked at me, and he kept looking and looking and looking, and finally he did this and rubbed across my face and looked at it. He thought the color would come off on his fingers.
I can attest to that. I've been called a chocolate person before. I've had a 5-year-old ask me, was I a chocolate person? But kids are innocent and they don't know.
No,
And
they
you have
don't
to explain
realize.
to them because they don't know.
But
So.
I think one of the most embarrassing questions ever asked me in Europe when I was in Germany, I had, in Germany, the German people called us brown soldatens. And I had a German fellow to ask me, Julius, warum the American Soldaten, why the brown soldiers fight for a country when they're hanging and killing your brothers in the South?
Yes, they were.
And it was a very difficult question to answer, but my answer to him was, we're fighting to make things better, to eliminate that action. That was my answer to him.
I told you before, I get very emotional. I think that is,
Well, you're a beautiful person.
it's very, very hard to understand that. It is very hard to understand that concept. You know, we deal with this every day when going to the grocery store, you know, when shopping for clothes, you know, at the office. You deal with this and you still push to show that I am just as good as everyone else.
Better.
And I'm better. I am better.
Well,
so I really appreciate you saying that.
years ago, there was no one of color in tennis.
Right.
But finally came a young lady by the name of Althea Gibson.
Yes,
And she became a champion.
she did.
Then after her, there came two sisters. And I watched one of them day before yesterday, still keeping on. She won again, the Williams sisters.
Yes, definitely.
At one time, we didn't have anyone swimming.
No, we didn't.
But I forget what his name was, but there's a person of color that won swimming.
Right.
Well, we won't talk about boxing because we've always handled that. But let's see, what else? There was a young lady, 17 years old, flew a jet plane from California to the east part of New York.
Tell us who that was.
That was 2 years ago.
Okay.
I forget her name. And I'm glad to say that all of the statements that were made about our unable to do things,
Being
I think if
intelligent
you
enough.
check,
Right.
you'll find out once we enter, we end up being the champion of whatever we decide to
Absolutely.
be.
Absolutely.
And that I'm very proud to be.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Once again, we're here with Julius T. Freeman. I'm at the MNN studio, the Manhattan Neighborhood Network in Harlem. I am LaChocolateBox, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Hi, this is your host, LaChocolateBox. Once again, we're here at the MNN studio in Harlem, and I'm speaking with Julius T. Freeman, original documented Tuskegee Airman. Before we wrap it up, we do have one more question from a studio audience member.
Yes.
Sir, your name?
Scott Green.
Once again, okay.
Mr. Freeman, I was wondering, you said you were discharged in 48. Wasn't 48 the year that Harry Truman supposedly integrated the Army or the whole military, 1948?
In 1948, Truman was the president. At that time, he signed an order eliminating segregation in the armed service. He desegregated and eliminated all segregation in the armed forces. And that broke up the Tuskegee Airmen at that time, because at that time, the Tuskegee Airmen was put into different branches of the Air Force. It was no longer, at one time there was two Air Force, black and white Air Force, a black and white Army, black and white Navy, but after that, the Army was integrated, and the Air Force was integrated.
So when the military was segregated, that's when the Tuskegee Airmen kind of flourished.
That's when we proved who we were.
Right.
That's it. That was right.
But it's always hardest trying to make that transition, which is what we're still going through now today
Yes.
in 2014.
Yes.
Yeah, we're still doing it, still are
Yes.
trying, but there's one thing that I'm doing. As long as there's breath in my body, I will definitely keep the legacy of the Tuskegee alive. I travel around each and every day with signs on my cars advertising the Tuskegee Airmen. I speak to the youth, tell them the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, and I will continue to do that as long as I live.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. We're just going to wrap up real quick. If there was just one message, I guess, to a young man who's thinking about entering into the service or the Air Force specifically, what advice would you give him that will carry him through his life to be a positive role model like yourself?
Well, actually, the greatest thing that any of the youth, in which I advise youth at all times, first decide what they want to do or be.
Okay.
Get that down perfect. Once they have decided this is what they want to do or be, let no one turn them around. Stick with it. Be successful. And if you're honest with yourself, if you're determined, you'll make it. Because when I think of 1948,
Okay.
when I was discharged, most people of color was being porters with Philip A. Randolph, but I didn't want to do that.
Okay.
I decided I wanted to go in the car business.
And that's where you're at right now.
In 1948, in Columbus, Ohio, there was no men of color selling cars. But I started selling Hudsons in 1948. Television was introduced in this country in 1948. The only persons of color on television in 1948 was Beulah, Stephen Fetcher, and Amos Nandy. But I was on television explaining the step-down design of the Hudson Hornet in 1948.
Okay.
And from that day forth, I've been with the automobile business. I started redesigning cars for
Nice.
Sammy Davis, James Brown, Wilson Pickett, the Isley Brothers, Joe Louis,
Beautiful.
Rose Morgan, Chuck Jackson, and I had a beautiful experience with that.
You have a beautiful history,
Thank you.
history. Just to tie out, the audience has been great. One mantra that I live by is always, in order for us to know how far we have come as a people, okay, or how far we can come as a people, we need to know how far we've come as a race. And I think that you're a true testament to that. I thank you so much, and I'm so humbled and honored that you came out today and you did an interview with us once again. This is DPTV Networks. We're at the MNN studio in Harlem, and that is it. Mr. Freeman, thank you so much for coming out.
And you've been
We really
beautiful. I enjoyed every
appreciate it.
moment. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you
been
so
great.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You did a beautiful job. Keep up the good work.
Thank
I
you.
really
I
enjoyed
will.
every moment of
I
it.
absolutely
Thank you.
will. Thank you so much.
We are here at the MNN El Barrio Firehouse Community Media Center. We spoke with Julius T. Freeman tonight. He is a D.O.T.A, D.O.T.A, documented original Tuskegee Airman. We had a great time. Can't wait to do it again. Mr. Freeman, you were a wonderful guest. To our audience out there, you're wonderful as well. We hope to see you again soon. This is LaChocolateBox signing off, and have a good night.